Good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to this workshop of the EARMA Ethics and Research Integrity Network. This is the first workshop of this kind that we're having, focusing on a specific topic, that is the implementation of the ALLEA-code of conduct for research integrity. Let me introduce myself. My name is Borana. I am project manager at the EARMA for Ethics and Research Integrity, and today I'm here also with two of my colleagues, Niall and Johanna, who will be there to support us throughout the workshop. Thank you to both of you. You have been numerous to respond to the invitation. We have around 100 colleagues who have registered for the workshop today, and I can see that already 70 of you are online. So welcome. We are looking forward to the program. We have a very nice speakers and sessions where we can interact with each other in different ways. In the first part, we have inspirations from 4 knowledgeable speakers. And then in a second part of the workshop, we will be able to put our videos and cameras on and exchange in a plenary discussion. For those of you who might be able and to stay a bit longer, we'll also have the opportunity to meet up in smaller breakout groups here on Zoom and meet in a more informal way around a coffee or so. Before I hand over to the moderator of the next session, a few practical ways on how you can interact now here on Zoom. You'll see that at the bottom of the bar, there is a Q&A section where you can use to introduce yourselves or speak with the other attendees. For questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A label, and then the moderators of the session will hand over the questions to the speakers for you. I won't take much time. I would like now to hand over to the moderator of the next session, Jonas from Stockholm University. Jonas is a Research Integrity and Ethics Coordinator at Stockholm University, and he is also ERION co-chair. Jonas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Borana. I'd like to wish you all a warm welcome to this meeting, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Maura Heine, who has huge experience from a lot of different initiatives and projects in the area of research ethics and integrity. She has a background in both science and medicine as a microbiologist and also a qualified nurse. And she has the perspective of founder, the Health Research Board. And she's also previously been the head of the research support services for NUI Galway. But now the function that mainly motivates her presence here today is that she's the chair of the ALLEA working group on science and ethics. So she has been and will be involved in the work with the ALLEA-code, and she will now today provide us with some background in terms of what happened and what will happen. So I will leave the floor now to Maura. Thank you.
What went into the research record in the first place. It's very important to maintain public confidence as well in research, because people need to be able to trust what they're being told by the scientific community and by policymakers, for example, who use the evidence being generated by the research community. And that in itself will help then to underpin public investment, because of course it is through their politicians that people make their preferences known. So if they don't trust researchers and research, they will let it be known that they don't do that. It may well sort of result in a reduction in public investment in research. That's something we definitely don't want to happen. But from the researcher's perspective also, this helps to protect the reputation and the careers of their themselves and their students. And in a clinical space, and I work in a health funding agency, we're very concerned about preventing any adverse outcomes from the research that we fund on patients and on the public. And so research integrity is a way of us trying to do that. And it also promotes economic development, because of course, if companies can trust the research that's coming out of laboratories and out of people's offices, let's say, and they can use those to develop innovative products and technologies and approaches, that is a really positive thing. And I suppose importantly, it avoids waste of research. So what happens if you don't develop a strong research culture? Well, okay, as I say, I come from a health funding agency, so we're very concerned about what can go wrong in the clinical sphere. And there is a lot of research that demonstrates that a lot can go wrong in the clinical sphere. And for example, even still, up to now, that number may be down around 30% at the moment, but even still in the clinical trial space, a huge number of clinical trials remain unreported or are not reported adequately, as in there are missing data about adverse effects. And that's particularly dangerous if clinicians don't know that there are adverse effects from a medication, they can prescribe in a misleading way. But it can also, from a kind of resource allocation perspective, if you provide misleading data about the benefits of something that's going to replace standard of care, and they're simply not true, that can result in a lot of waste and futile health system costs. And the thing is, even if it's found, let's say, that there is fraudulent data in a clinical research paper or any research paper, in fact, retraction of that paper is not the golden bullet, because retractions can take a very, very long time to happen, anything up to 79 months or even longer in some cases. And there was a very interesting 2011 review of retracted papers in the clinical sphere. 180 of those were for primary clinical studies, and then 851 were secondary clinical studies that used the data in the primary clinical studies. And what they found was that, people were still developing secondary clinical studies and even primary clinical studies before the paper was retracted, because it took so long for the paper to be taken out. And, there were a huge number of people enrolled in those studies who could potentially be harmed. So retraction is not the only answer. And of course, retracted articles live on in the literature, because everything's online now. 75% of retracted articles in Medline, for example, in the period 1973 to 2010 are still available on publishers and non-publisher websites. So, you retract it from the journal, but it's still out there in the world. And of course, they can have a huge impact on the field. The impact, for example, it's a really good example, it's a strong example, is the Wakefield study on the dangers of vaccinating your children and the links to autism. And that has had a massive, and continues to have a massive impact on the levels of vaccination of children for MMR. So, this one in particular, I think, this is still happening even now. And this is from an Irish newspaper in 2018, that, children who should have been vaccinated against measles were not. And there was a huge outbreak of measles in school children. And of course, measles aren't just about getting spots. You can go deaf and it can actually kill people. So it's very dangerous. And that also goes for, it trebled. The number of measles outbreaks trebled in 2018. And of course, it wasn't just in Ireland. This happens all over the world. So, for example, the Philippines also reported a massive outbreak of measles. And this should never have happened. And this was really thanks to Wakefield. So the impacts in the system can reverberate out for many, many years to come. There are also collateral damages of misconduct. The two researchers, for example, and the graduate students that were supervised by a discredited researcher. There is what's called a retraction penalty. So in other words, if you're associated with a retracted, discredited researcher or their articles, you can yourself see, even if you're completely innocent, an average fall in your citation rate of nearly 7% per year. And that can take a long time to recover. And then there's also citation penalty in terms of the field in which you work. And citations in that field can become less cited because people are a little bit suspicious about the field now. And decreases in articles and flows of funding into that field can also be affected. And of course, you know, working in universities, we'll all know that there are direct financial costs to misconduct. So the average cost of investigating a case that results in a retracted article for the NIH, they reported a cost of nearly $400,000. You know, so, but I actually think that in some cases it can be a lot more expensive. And so, you know, they have spent a massive amount of money, was wasted on research that resulted in papers that had to be retracted. And of course, the cost of doing an investigation itself can be extremely expensive for an institution. And of course, then there are those indirect costs. There's the waste, there's just the waste of unproductive research that was based on flawed data. And there's not just the damage to the researchers, but also to the laboratories, to their institutions. And in the clinical sphere, there is also the indirect costs of preventable illness, like those outbreaks of measles, or even, God forbid, loss of life. So this really is a wicked problem, and it has many, many influences that are operating in a resource-limited environment in terms of the governance, the code of conducts and their absence, that it's not a priority for organisations or that it's very poorly resourced. There is the whole difficulty around promotion and prevention. You know, graduate programs are still very fragmented, and, you know, the curricula are patchy. There's still some issues around the quality of teaching, around research integrity and ethics. And the problem, of course, is that there is still very little, or in sometimes in cases, no training for senior researchers who also need to be trained. And there is still a difficulty, and now it's getting a lot better. I think journals are becoming very conscious about it, and so are funding agencies, that, you know, this drive for innovative research, that it won't be funded unless it's innovative. That is starting to fall away a little bit, where people are starting to think more now about societal relevance. And it has been, up to quite recently, very difficult to publish negative results. And unfortunately, there are still some journals who will not publish negative results. But in the open access world, and also there are particular journals specific to this, it is getting more and more possible to publish negative results, which is great. It's also very difficult to get the funding for and to publish replication studies. And unfortunately, for a lot of researchers, you know, open access, they will publish in open access journals some of the time, but it certainly wouldn't be the norm for them. And, you know, we still have this winner takes all approach to both careers and funding, and people, you know, the emphasis being on high impact journals and citation and so on and so forth, though there is a huge amount of work being done across the globe to try and tackle this. And it's all about then creating a proper environment and culture, but that really does need top-down support in the institutions, and that is not always available to people. And, you know, there aren't really any incentives for good research practice for researchers in terms of career advancement, for example. And I think that it's still not fully appreciated by institutions, the importance of mentors. Finelli did a very interesting paper back in, I can't remember the date now, exactly about 2014, I think, where he looked at what were the things that actually really influence bad behaviour. And one of the key things he found was the absence of robust policies at a national institution level. If they didn't exist, that really damaged let's say the efforts of individuals, laboratories, departments to try and put in place good research practices and a good culture for research. I mean, as I've mentioned, all of the, you know, the perverse incentives that the academic career system and the assessment of research for funding has had and continues to have. But as I say, there is a massive effort now to try and deal with that. You know, there are still social cultural differences in how people approach codes of conduct, for example. And there is still, unfortunately, some lack of promotion, prevention, training, mentoring, and so on and so forth around research integrity. And of course, career stage has a huge influence, because the early career researchers are really in a very vulnerable position. So what about this wicked problem then? Well, what the European Code of Conduct, well, any code of conduct really at a national level, is trying to do is to tackle that governance and codes of conduct piece of the wicked problem. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, it wasn't that we didn't have a code of conduct in Europe. There had been a very interesting survey done by Science Europe way back, which looked at what people were actually doing around Europe to foster integrity in research. This was back in 2009, I think. And from that, the I think it was 2010 or 11, ALLEA and the European Science Foundation got together, and they did actually publish a code of conduct, which was brilliant. It was the first time we'd had a European code of conduct, but this was obviously getting out of date. So in February 2016, the European Commission contacted ALLEA, asking that they would look at the ESF ALLEA-code of conduct published back in 2010 and consider revising it, because they wanted to be able to reference it in their framework contracts and the terms and conditions of Horizon 2020 projects. And they just felt that it wasn't, the way it was currently written wasn't appropriate to that. They also had a few issues that they felt were not tackled. So that was the motivation for them, because they had seen a steady, they were investing more in research, and so were lots of other people. They had realized that that traditional reliance on self-regulation, much beloved of the academic sphere, was really no longer appropriate, had been proven not to be effective. And because there was, and especially Commissioner Moedas was very keen on the open science agenda, but that was starting to throw up some concerns around data management and sharing, open access, and indeed research integrity itself. And of course, you know, Horizon Europe has a huge emphasis on collaboration across sectors and especially industry, and really the existing codes were not fit for purpose when it came to that. They really were worried about the training and mentorship. They knew it was vital, and they also knew it was patchy. And of course, they and everybody else was worried about reproducibility of research results, I can never pronounce that word, replaceability of science data. And there has been some very interesting papers in the Lancet that had sort of brought this to the fore. So that was what was driving the Commission. So what did we need to do then to do this actual revision? Okay, well, we did need to think about what had changed in the environment since 2010 from a technological perspective, you know, in terms of the open science agenda, but also in terms of things like, you know, the emergence of citizen science, crowdfunding of research, and so on and so forth. We also wanted to, it was a very long document, the original document, and we wanted to boil it down to something that was a lot more usable and accessible so that we could have widespread penetration and that it might actually be useful for national and local codes. The language was very important. To be honest, I think the language in the original code was quite academic. It could sometimes be a little bit obtruse. So we really wanted to get with some very clear, crisp, unambiguous language, because we knew it was going to be translated into many different languages. We also wanted to include not just ALLEA, let's say, and the Commission. We wanted to talk to a lot of people. We wanted to talk to people out in the research system, but we also wanted to talk to industry because they had not been included in any conversations around the previous code. As I say, we felt that the language also needed to talk about what people would do and in being better researchers and supporting organizations, not what they should do, because should do is a very kind of, you know, it's beating people over the head with a stick. So we didn't really want people to come away with that. So the revision started in April 2016, went on for, we actually did it quite quickly, really, if you think about it, went on for about 8 months. Until January 17, when we had a draft. We did extensive stakeholder consultation right across Europe. It was done in 2 phases. So we basically did a first phase of written feedback where we asked people to identify issues they thought hadn't been handled in the original code. Then we did a draft of the new code, and we went back out to people then to ask them, were we missing anything? And that is the result. So there's the link to the code. I'm sure you've seen it. Okay. So what was changed then? Well, first of all, we changed the principles. There were a kind of quite a long list of principles in the original code, but we felt that some of those weren't really principles. They were more about the processes of doing the research. So we boiled down the principles to 4 that had a kind of a logic around how you actually think about developing, doing, disseminating your research. So those ended up being reliability, So this is all about the quality of the research, and it includes design and methodology, about honesty, obviously, in how you develop, how you report, how you communicate research. The respect for colleagues we felt was very important, but also for research participants, for society at large, and the ecosystem, culture, and the environment, and accountability. And I mean, this was something that really hadn't been brought to the fore in the original principles. So there were some structural changes as well. So there's a little table of contents in front of you. The first thing we did was we positioned research environment right at the top, because that is the thing that will really help good research practice to flourish. We then greatly expanded. There had been some mention of teaching and supervision in the originals code, but really there wasn't a great deal. So we greatly expanded the teaching, supervision and mentoring section to reflect its importance. We included a new section on collaboration. Amazingly, there wasn't a section on that in the original code. And then we expanded all of the sections to take account of changes. So in terms of training and supervision and mentoring, this was really, and this was something that the Commission had identified that they wanted it to be much expanded. We also focused, because based on, again, the Lancet articles and others that have been published by the likes of Lex Boulter, we emphasised the design, the methodology as really being vital, and proper training in that vital to underpinning good research practices. And we didn't confine training to just the junior researchers, which kind of had been the case in the original code, but we saw it as something that needed to happen right across a person's career. And again, because we were concerned, but the Commission was also concerned about really emphasising the importance of mentoring. Research procedures, again, there was a great deal had changed in the system. And one of the things that has kind of emerged, especially from DORA, for example, is taking account of the state of the art to reduce duplication and research waste. So that was included, that hadn't been there. And this is now something that's been taken up by many funding agencies. It was very important for the Commission that we included something around the conscientious and proper use of research funds, because they had seen a lot of misuse of funds over the years. And also we felt that it was very important that people understand that there is an obligation to publish, that you cannot withhold results from your peers. I mean, this goes against the whole idea of building the research records. So there was a new section put in there around that. In terms of safeguards, one thing that had been missing from the previous code was the impacts of gender, for example, age, ethnicity, cultural background, and so on, in actually developing, designing and conducting your research and interpreting the data. So it's very important that you take account of these. And of course, there's been a huge amount of work done in trying to improve the generation and sharing of research data and making it open. So there were a number of additions there sort of linked into the open science agenda. As I say, collaborative working hadn't been mentioned at all in the previous code, which was absolutely extraordinary. There were some very good principles set out by the Montreal Statement on collaboration. And, all of this was kind of hinging on people agreeing at the very, very outset about whose responsibility for what, that they have joint responsibility, and really working out what it is they needed to discuss when they were setting out on a collaboration. And publication and dissemination, again, some of this linked to the open science agenda, but to excellent COPE guidelines that had been developed in the meanwhile, and also sort of trying to encourage people to promptly report where they found an error, an honest error, and correct that, retract as quickly as possible. And again, this importance of publishing negative results. And we also added in, because unfortunately there were new unacceptable research practices, we also expanded that greatly to take account of issues that people rose with us when we were doing stakeholder consultation. So has there been any impact on this? Well, there certainly has been an impact on the governance codes of conduct piece. For example, it is now a part of the Horizon 2020 grant agreement, and it will also be included in Horizon Europe. So the code is specifically referenced, and people are expected to adhere to the code or codes that are evolved from that. A number of European countries have actually evolved national codes, guidelines and policies and so on that are linked directly to the code of conduct as the reference document. And as I say, funding agencies also are now starting in their terms of reference or terms and conditions to reference specifically the European Code of Conduct or national conduct policies derived directly from it. And of course, this code has been translated into all of the European language, but also into Chinese, Japanese, Arabic, Turkish, and there are requests coming in for other languages all the time. The EU then kind of tried to put its money where its mouth was a little bit, and certainly it put research integrity as one of the key pillars of the open science agenda, which was great because that hadn't really been the case before. So that was very much thanks to Commissioner Moedas. But also the Science with and for Society programme, the SWARS programme, references the Code of Conduct as a founding document for pretty much all of the projects that it has funded. So just as a kind of little example from Ireland, there is a cascade effect to having a code like this. So as I say, in 2010, ALLEA and ESF published the 2010 European Code of Conduct. That started a whole conversation in Ireland with loads of different workshops, and there's a report from one of the sorry, that's not the report, that is actually the code. So there were loads of workshops, reports, etc., and a group got together, including myself and a couple of VPs research in universities, the Royal Irish Academy, and one other funder. And we actually ended up publishing an Irish framework for ensuring integrity in Irish research, and that got published in 2010 as well. And then in 2015, this was revised and updated, and it became a much more usable document for the universities. But it also resulted, that 2010 publication resulted in the formation of a national research integrity forum. So Ireland doesn't have an office, but it does have a forum where all of the funders, the quality agencies and the universities sit around a table. And what they have done is they have agreed many new policies and processes in the universities that have strengthened their good practice guidelines. The funders group have also worked together to try and strengthen this in funding terms and conditions and processes. It has been included in training, and it was mentioned for the first time in the national R&D strategy, which was a huge coup for us. But then in 2017, with the publication of the European Code of Conduct, we did a revision of our code, and there's the new Code of Conduct, and that now will feed back in to all of these other things that I've mentioned, and everybody will look at how they may need to change what they're doing. So there is a massive cascade effect from having a Code of Conduct. It's also had a huge contribution, I think, to awareness raising. I mean, research integrity is now on the agenda for discussion in a way that you just couldn't have imagined 20 years ago. It was just really unimaginable. I mean, the Council of Ministers actually did a conclusion on research integrity back in 2016, and again, that would have been pretty unimaginative, a couple of years before that. And it is seen as a legitimate area for research, and that has certainly been backed up by the Commission's SWARF projects. As I say, one of the key things about the European Code of Conduct as it stands is it was based on very, very broad consultation, including enterprise, and that has been incredibly important. And it's received a lot of media attention over the years. And it's been included as a clause in Horizon 2020, as I mentioned, and again, will be included in Horizon Europe. And what is, I think more and more organisations realise the importance of this and are now starting to offer really good quality training in many instances, at least at postgraduate level, maybe not so much at the more senior levels. So I think that there is a greater understanding now than there was even 5 years ago about the importance of climate and environment. So there are emerging issues, of course, because this is a very fast moving area. And, artificial intelligence and some of the other cutting edge technologies that have really come to the fore in the last 5 years are not specifically referenced in the current European Code. Unfortunately, predatory publishing, because of the way people are now publishing in a more open way in open access journals, predatory publishing has really become a problem, and much more so than it would have been 6-7 years ago. There is a whole question now about how do you implement research integrity in innovation? How do we ensure that integrity doesn't get lost when people are kind of rushing to try and monetize output from research? And also I think there are still conversations to be had around the different approaches the different disciplines are taking to the implementation of research integrity. And this is particularly, I suppose, relevant in the humanities, the arts, the social sciences, who might not have seen themselves inside this fold maybe 10 years or even 5 years ago, because they wouldn't have had, for example, in many instances, to get ethics approval for the research. So they were kind of, you know, paddling their own canoes. And again, it's, you know, it's how do we make sure that everybody is singing off the same hymn sheet? Again, another thing that has become particularly kind of important, you know, and the coronavirus outbreak was a kind of a sad sort of exemplar of this, is about how researchers communicate their research. There's been a lot of misinformation, false promises being reported around COVID-19, but it isn't just around that. I mean, I think this is an issue that the research community itself has also become very aware of. And of course, all metrics have become much more important, and the use of social media. So there is a question around responsible research communication that we really do need to look at. And as I say, citizen science has not gone away. This is something the Commission is very interested in, but I think that it may possibly need to be a new code. I'm not sure that the European code can really take on some of the issues that are being raised by citizen science. And as I say, we're working in a very diverse world. So where do we go from here? Well, I think we've acknowledged that we do need to do a further revision, even though it's only been, you know, 3 years actually since the publication of the last, well, 4 years now since the publication of the last one. A lot has happened even in 4 years, because as I say, this is a very fast moving area. But we have to be careful about this, because the European Code of Conduct is already integrated into many, many national and organisational codes, and indeed at a global and European level. So rather than doing a full kind of root and branch revision, I mean, we think that it's still pretty much fit for purpose, but we do need to do a refresh. And we think that would be an appropriate way to do this rather than a full revision. We have been gathering a log of possible issues that, you know, stakeholders have fed back to us, that we've come across ourselves and so on. And those will be considered in the refresh, and including also emerging issues, for example, that the Commission have brought to our attention. We have consulted the European Commission about how this would align with the Horizon Europe clauses in the grant agreements. And as I say, they are very happy that if we take the refreshed approach, that there should be absolutely no problems about that. And actually they plan to put the European Code of Conduct on a statutory basis in their grant agreements. It would be the only code, if you like, that would actually have this status. So that's a fantastic thing, really, that they're moving to do that. We've learned a lot from the first time round. About what we could do better around stakeholder consultation, but also about some of the new stakeholders perhaps that need to be consulted. And we're drawing up a list of these, if you like. We meet in the beginning of March, and we'll draw up some timelines for the refresh, and we would hope to be publishing it in 2022. So thank you very much for listening. That was a kind of a whistle-stop tour through the European Code of Conduct, and I'm really happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Maura. So you put your questions in the Q&A, and you can use the chat for more sort of general communication with other members. But I think I saw something in the chat now, which I think is a question for Maura. So we'll start with that one anyway. So this is from, can I see who this is from? From Dennis Vegem. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your name right, but I'd like to ask a question. The 4 main principles of the code are very valuable. They remain high level though. Where should we look for more concrete implementations, for more details on what the principles imply? Are there any national or EU-wide documents you would recommend that elaborate on these main principles?
I don't know of any documents that elaborate specifically on the principles. I mean, I think the thing to remember about the European Code is it's a framework. It is high level. It is of necessity high level, because Europe is a highly heterogeneous system. You know, there are different national laws, different disciplinary approaches, different levels of funding, different levels of training for researchers. I mean, it's just a very, very heterogeneous system. So I think this is as close as we've come to an attempt to try and harmonise, at least at a very high level, national and institutional codes. So to a certain extent, what we are saying to people, I guess, is, here's a framework for you to think about. Here are the things you need to consider. And even in terms of the principles, I think that those conversations need to happen at a national level or even at a disciplinary level. So to my discipline or to my country, what does the principle of reliability or accountability actually mean to us in practice, and how might we be able to see it? I don't think the code would never have set out to lay stuff out in that kind of detail. Look, if I come across any documents, I'll send them on to Borana and Jonas. So, but I haven't really seen anything that has been specifically, tried to think about how you might implement the principles. It's much more about how you might implement the framework, the code itself. I don't know if that answers your question, Daniel, but
no, I mean, I think it's obvious to all of us that it's difficult for you to sit here and recommend specific documents at the national level, because there's such a huge variety of different levels and the implementation of this. But I think it's clear that that's the level where we need to look for the more specific guidance, right? We will never be able to provide that on the European level because of the
absolutely. And I think that was something, I think that was possibly one of the problems with the previous code. Well, it was written by two very different organizations, so there was almost like two codes in one, but there were some very long treatises within that code about the meaning of science and the meaning of research and what it means to be a researcher and all of that kind of stuff. But I think we wanted to get more practical in some ways. But again, recognizing that all we really would be able to do was produce a framework, and that it is up to people then to figure out how to implement in line with national need. But I think if you use the kind of the framework as a table of contents almost, and then start figuring out, okay, in this area, what could we do? I mean, we had some very interesting discussions in the National Forum about, for example, the responsibilities of institutions. What did that actually mean in the Irish context? And came up with some very interesting plans, let's say, for the different research institutions around the country and how they might work together, for example, to improve their training. Could they share curricula, for example, rather than everybody going off and developing their own curricula? And we put some funding into a national training platform that everybody could have access to. So, as I say, I think even having those discussions at a national level about what this means to me or what this means to us is actually very useful.
Thank you. We do have another question. Now I'm a bit confused about what happened. We have a question from Joanna Porcel, but it's not really a clear question. Let's see. So it's a more of a comment, and
okay.
There might be a question here. I'm just trying to. But so there's this problem. So Joanna says that my impression is that we have several codes and that the principles are quite clear, but that what we need is an alignment on the different actors. Funding agencies must, of course, include clauses in the requirements and contracts to promote integrity. But then research institutions must be fairly evaluated when requesting funds. It should not be acceptable then that the funding agencies use as the main criteria or the only criteria to assess quantitative bibliometrical indicators.
Okay.
So there's
okay. So it's actually a slightly different question. I know where he's going with this one. I mean, that is a different question in a way, because that is. I suppose that speaks to the whole debate that's going on around research assessment at the moment. And I absolutely agree with him that, everybody needs to be aligned with this. And I suppose the DORA principles would be the place to go if you were looking for principles around research assessment. And in fact, there is an international funders group who are looking at how they can apply the DORA principles for qualitative and fair research assessment into research funding agency processes. And then I suppose it is very important that the funding agencies are then extremely transparent about how they're actually going to assess research. I think he's right. There is still a misalignment sometimes between how the research institutions are assessing people, for example, for hiring and promotion. There is still, I think, a little bit of too much reliance on, impact factors and, publishing in high impact journals and citation rates and so on and so forth. And the funders are trying to move ahead and move away from that. So I think it will take a little bit of time for that alignment to happen. But I mean, the reality is that the institutions will follow the money. And if the funders are saying, this is how we're going to assess, these are the things that we're going to look at that are important, I can assure you that the research performing organisations will line up underneath them eventually. Unfortunately, sometimes it has to come from one place first and then the alignment happens. But I agree with them, there isn't quite an alignment achieved yet. But it's certainly, I think there's a huge amount of work going on across the world on this.
So I don't think we have any more questions. We have a few minutes left. Can I just ask a question?
Yeah, of course you can.
From my side. So this is very general, but I'm curious about, so this document was launched and presented as a something for researchers and research organizations as a self-regulatory document, framework for self-regulation, as it says in the introduction. But it's being used in various contexts which go beyond that, right? So, for instance, we'll hear more about the Swedish context later, but it's referred to in different legal contexts and so on. And had you expected it to get that kind of impact and be used in that manner? And do you think that the document is adapted for that kind of application, or do you see a problem here?
I see a problem with that, to be perfectly honest. No, we didn't expect, and we did have some very strange queries about very specific lines or wording in the European Code of Conduct that were being interpreted by lawyers in particular misconduct cases in a particular way. And essentially what they were trying to do was use that to override national legislation. I mean, that was just outrageous, and it's tried from the lawyers. But, every time we go back, and we were very clear about this, it is not a legal document. It is not a set of regulations. That is spelt out very, very clearly in the beginning. But I suppose you can't always stop people from trying to make more of it for if it suits them than was actually intended. So I suppose in a revision, I think we'll look at the introduction again and make sure that, how clear do we have to be about this? I mean, I suppose the one place that it has, and again, we were a little surprised to hear that the Commission were going down the route of making it a statutory obligation, even though it's only a framework and a code. But having said that, I suppose, in some ways the Commission do their own things. On the one hand, I don't want to discourage the Commission because actually, again, it's money follows the, money or people follow the money. So if the Commission says jump, people will generally say, well, how high do I need to jump? So I think on the one hand, it's great that they're really serious about people actually having good research practice frameworks and policies and processes in place. I think that's fantastic. I'm a little concerned about that statutory piece, I have to say, because this was never intended to be. Now, I know they've had their lawyers look at it, and again, it's probably at a terribly high level, and anybody rocking up in court, I think it would be just thrown out completely. But that's a little concerning, but there isn't a great deal we can do about stopping people from taking this and using it in a way perhaps it wasn't intended, other than trying to make sure that in the revision, the refresh, that we look at that first piece and just be very, very clear. I mean, we thought we were being really clear. We clearly weren't clear enough that this is what that is intended for. I don't know.
Maybe there's a difference between different sections of the document. I mean, the more positive section, section 2, where you have all these, that's perhaps not as risky in a sense, and that might be fine to have from a funder, but then the section 3 where you have the misconduct.
And we did actually, Jonas, at the beginning, we did actually consider not including a section on misconduct. and just simply having the good research practices. But it is a code of conduct. And so ultimately, and I don't think the Commission would have been very happy with us if we left that out anyway. But ultimately, we did feel that we needed to include that. But again, more as, and you know, you can never, I don't think it would be humanly possible to develop a completely inclusive list of all the misconducts that people can think of. You know, there are different things happen every single day. But I suppose what we, again, and this is probably something we need to be very clear about, we were giving people examples of what should be considered misconduct, you know, so you know, because there were things that were considered, you know, it's fine, you know, that's not really misconduct. That's, you know, it's just, you know, it's silliness or I don't know, whatever. So it was very important to kind of set that out. Look, these really should be considered, especially if it's something that is a recurring behavior in somebody. You know, if somebody does something once, it, you know, that's just sloppiness or whatever. If they do it 10 times, it moves from being sloppy to being something that's quite clearly thought out, and you know, it crystallizes into an intent, let's say. I mean, there is a huge problem about proving intent, of course, to misconduct. So, you know, but I think it is about looking at the history of the person's behavior as much as anything. So, yeah, you're right. It's not very negative, but it was kind of unavoidable that we had to put it in there. Yeah.
Thank you, Maura. I think it's time to round off the session. And
great. Okay.
Thank you so much for this very informative and I think for our purposes today, very helpful presentation. I think this will make a great contribution to the discussion and to all those who perhaps aren't that familiar with the code and its history. Because I learned a lot from this too. So thank you very much, Maura.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks also from
leave the
my
word
side.
to Borana.
Thanks, Borana. Yes. Thank you. Okay.
To both of you. So now I think we have deserved a short break to stretch our legs. And we meet again at 2 p.m. Central European Time. See you later. And we are now slowly going to the next session that will be moderated by Stephanie. I'm checking if Stephanie is already online, first of all. Yes, I can see her. Hi. Let me introduce Stephanie. Probably you know her already. She is a Research Integrity and Ethics Advisor at Ghent University in Belgium. And Stephanie is together with Jonas ERION co-chair. And she will moderate the next session today. This to you, Stephanie.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody from my side as well. I will try and guide you through our 3 inspirational talks this afternoon. Every speaker has a 10-minute time slot. So speakers, if you start hearing strange noises, it is me trying to break into your session and tell you that time's up. We'll have the 3 speakers first and then questions afterwards. But obviously you can already write them down during the presentations in the Q&A. So please do not use the chat. We have the Q&A for all questions. If you have any specific questions for a specific person, just write their name first and then add your question. So we know who to address afterwards. First on my list is my Flemish colleague, Inge Le Rouge. She is Research Integrity Coordinator at KU Leuven, but you might also know her from her work in the steering board of LERU. She is, among other things, co-author of a LERU paper towards a research integrity culture at universities, from recommendations to implementations, which is a must-read for all of you working on the topic. I will put the link in the chat in a minute, and in between that, Inge, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephanie. I will try to share my screen. Just a moment. Is that working? I hope so. Okay, thank you for giving me the opportunity to give you some insights in how we at KU Leuven and more broadly at the regional and national level use and implement the ALLEA-code. I am working at KU Leuven as the Research Integrity and Ethics Coordinator. First, a few words about the national and regional context. KU Leuven is a university located in Belgium, more in particular in the northern Dutch-speaking part of our country, a region that is also called Flanders. And in fact, we have 5 universities in Flanders, spread all over the country, over the region, Flanders, as you can see on this map. And as regards to the research integrity approaches in Flanders, we have a university system of self-regulation. This means that it is not governed by law, as is the case in some other countries, and that the research community has drawn up its own rules, and we evaluate the behavior of our own researchers. We have a Commission on Research Integrity, for instance, at all Flemish universities, who are handling allegations on research misconduct. Second, there is also a strong collaboration amongst the 5 Flemish universities. We have a platform, therefore, the VLIR platform, and VLIR stands for Flemish Inter-University Council. We have a working group on research integrity, where we share ideas and experiences on the topic of research integrity. And finally, there is also a commission at the regional level, the Flemish Commission for Research Integrity, we call it in Dutch the VCWI, and they have a dual task. They can give a second advice on a specific research misconduct case that has been investigated within the university. And on the other hand, they can also give advice on topics, more generic topics related to research integrity. As you can see on this slide, because in Belgium we have a national code of ethics, but it was developed in 2009, so a long time ago, and no update is foreseen. It was developed by the 4 Belgian academies. But the question popped up whether this national code of 2009 should be updated. And very recently, the VCWI published a general advice on this question, and they, in their advice, they judged that it is more valuable to endorse the ALLEA-code as the leading document with regard to research integrity. It is mentioned that it is undesirable to develop a novel national or a regional code of conduct. And they mentioned a couple of reasons for that. The first reason that was mentioned in their advice is that it could introduce additional differences in national norms. A second reason was that it would, of course, require a substantial amount of time and effort, time and effort that could be investigated in other important projects. As we heard already in the previous presentation, the ALLEA-code will also be embedded in the Horizon Europe regulation and will receive there a prominent place. And it is also a guide for research institutions. So the ALLEA-code is not only a code or a guide for the individual researcher, but it also addresses the research institutions. They formulated 5 recommendations. The first recommendation is to endorse the ALLEA-code and publicly highlight this endorsement. The second one is to actively pursue that every scientist and research policy officer has read this document. The third is to use it institution-wide as a leading document, to communicate structurally and transparently, and to provide in training about the behavior that is expected from researchers by referring to the ALLEA-code. And finally, to wield it as a primordial framework in assessing potential research integrity breaches. So this makes clear that in Flanders, the ALLEA-code should get a prominent place in the research integrity framework of our universities. However, it will be a challenge, for instance, to achieve that every researcher in our universities will have read the ALLEA-code, but we can, of course, give it a try. Another initiative that I want to mention here is the development of a new online learning tool that we are developing together with all the Flemish universities. And why do I want to mention it here in this session? Because the ALLEA-code has inspired us during this development on two levels. The level of the structure of our tool, which is still under development, but we have a module on good research practices, and we have also a module on the violations of research integrity. And by the way, we have also a module on supervision and mentoring. We just heard from Maura Heine that this is also a very important element of the ALLEA-code. And content-wise, we have introduced many references to the ALLEA-code in our online tool, and we have a specific layout for that, as you can see on this slide, where we highlight in our tool the specific fragments that are from the ALLEA-code. So we want to make our researchers familiar with this code and also, of course, with the content of this code. But how do we implement the ALLEA-code in Leuven at my university? The ALLEA-code is an important document for policy development. And as I already mentioned, the code is not only a guide for the researcher, but also for the institution. And the institution has also a responsibility regarding research integrity. And in the Netherlands, they call it institution's duty of care. In Leuven, the KU Leuven endorses the ALLEA-code. This means that every researcher in Leuven has to follow the principles that are described in the code and the good research practices in the code. And I want to mention also two other issues. The first one is that research integrity is one of the 5 priorities in our research policy plan. This means that it is really integrated in our research policy. And there's also a reference in our research policy plan to the ALLEA-code. And an important milestone was also the opening speech of our rector, Luc Sels, in 2018. You can see a picture of him on the slide. So he chose the topic of research integrity for his opening lecture to open the academic year 2018-2019, and with the title Integrity and Trust are absolutely vital for a university. So this means that research integrity is also a priority at the level of the policymakers within our university. And in his speech, he stressed also the importance of awareness of the code, not only of its existence, but more importantly, also about its content. And how are we translating the ALLEA principles in our policy? Just a few examples, for instance, by providing clear policies and procedures on good research practice. We have a clear statement on good authorship practices. We have guidelines on what is and is not permitted in the domain of image manipulation. We have also a policy on research data management. We have transparent reports about research misconduct investigations. We publish anonymized summaries of our research misconduct cases on our website. And it was also mentioned in the previous presentation, also the open science agenda was important and is still important also in the ALLEA-code. And therefore we installed within our university an open science task force, and also we appointed an open science ambassador to coordinate, guide and stimulate the process of transforming the university towards more openness, while of course respecting the limitations of that openness, as open as possible, as closed as needed. Another initiative that I want to mention here is that we also included a reference to the ALLEA-code in our guidelines for internal funds at KU Leuven. So a reference is included that all researchers who receive funding from that fund have to respect also the ALLEA-code. And in the general regulations of the same internal funds, we also have an inclusion that on the occasion of serious infringements of the research integrity by our Commission on Research Integrity, the academic authorities can decide to limit or forbid the opportunities of a researcher to apply for internal funding or to make use of it. Second, the ALLEA-code is also an important document for guidance, training, supporting good research practices. A few examples, we have a reference to the ALLEA-code on our website of research integrity. The reference is also included in our procedure for the Commission on Research Integrity. So it's mentioned that we endorse this ALLEA-code. The ALLEA-code is also mentioned in our training initiatives, for instance, in the research integrity lecture that is compulsory for all starting PhD students, but also in the iSupervise masterclass for supervisors. The ALLEA-code is also actively used in some research integrity workshops, for instance, when we are discussing some research integrity dilemmas with the participants. At the end of the discussion, we also refer to specific fragments in the ALLEA-code about the linked good research practice. ALLEA-code is also mentioned in a checklist for research integrity for the PhD research and the promoter. And it is likely to be part of a research integrity commitment or a research integrity oath at the PhD defense. So the promoter will ask the PhD candidate to promise in the future to act in accordance with the basic principles of research integrity as set out in the ALLEA-code. And this is my last slide. We just heard that the ALLEA-code is not a legal instrument, and we also have a self-regulation system. So I will not mention it here as a legal document, but we use this document in assessing potential research integrity breaches by our Commission on Research Integrity. So it's an important framework for that commission. And this on two levels, the content-wise, for defining the scope of the investigations, for instance, to give an answer on the question whether the complaint is related to research integrity. And further on in the process, also to justify the decision, where we can link, for instance, to the last part in the ALLEA-code about the violations of research integrity. And process-wise, the ALLEA principles are also implemented in the investigation process of our commission. And I just add here two examples. The fairness to all parties is an important principle. That persons accused of research misconduct are given full details of the allegations and allowed a fair process for responding to allegations and presenting evidence. This is not always easy because we have also an option in our procedure that the identity of a notifying party can stay confidential towards the accused person, but nevertheless we try to inform our accused person in a good way. And finally, the principle that anyone accused of research misconduct is presumed innocent until proven otherwise. And this is a principle that we highly value also in the CRI of KU Leuven. That's the end of my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Inge, for this presentation. We're running a little bit out of time, so but that's okay because there weren't a lot of questions, but I just spotted one from Maura, who would be very interesting to hear where deficits in the ALLEA-code have emerged as you implemented it in your university. So if you maybe, Inge, want to respond to that very briefly, then we can have this one question.
So as you mentioned already in your presentation, for instance, in the last section of the ALLEA-code, the section about violations on research integrity, it's not an exhaustive list of all the infringements that are related to research misconduct or unacceptable practices, as it is mentioned in the ALLEA-code. So sometimes we are confronted with issues that are not especially or particularly mentioned in the code, but I think this is not really a problem because it's very clear stated in the document that it is not an inclusive list. That's the first reflection on your question, but I will think about it.
You have more opportunities if you want to think about it and respond. Then we can definitely come back to that point in the plenary discussion.
It's fine.
So now we will go to the presentation of Mats. Mats Johansson is a philosopher and associate professor in medical ethics. He works as an ethics advisor at Lund University in Sweden, and amongst other things, he is also part of the expert group on research integrity. That's part of the Association of Swedish Higher Education Institutions. Wow, that was a mouthful. Mats, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will start to share my screen. If this works. It works?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Thanks for this opportunity to discuss some of the lessons from a Swedish perspective. And although I will discuss some lessons from Sweden, I think they are relevant to any academic context, actually. So first, I want to say something about ALLEA's Code of Conduct and the relevance in Sweden at the national level and at an institutional level. So you know that the code identifies both what researchers and institutions should do and what they should not do, so misconduct, so to speak, and outlines how allegations of scientific misconduct should be handled. And all these aspects have been relevant when we have drafted policies and regulations in Sweden, and definitely on my university, but also on a national level, and I will return to that in a moment. Because up to quite recently, we in Sweden had a self-regulating system where universities handled all aspects of misconduct themselves. But the government launched an inquiry a couple of years ago that was instructed to investigate the need for new procedures. And important in this task was to propose a solution that ensure a clear and legally certain handling of alleged misconduct. And this resulted in a system that consists of two parts, so to speak. So we nowadays have a central board that handles certain kinds of allegations. But other forms of scientific misconduct is still handled by the research universities, research institutions. And so to speak, we are more centralized today than before, but you should know that in Sweden, the regulation is already centralized in other respects. So ethical review in Sweden is conducted by a single authority, all for that conduct review and approvals for all universities in Sweden. So I think that's, if not unique, a fairly special solution that we have. But what was interesting in this inquiry and their proposals and what eventually also became the law was that they launched a new concept, research misconduct, or rather in Swedish oredlighet i forskning, that was defined in this way. So you are familiar with the FFP that is mentioned here. So the definition is that serious breaches of good scientific practice in the form of fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism that are committed intentionally or with gross negligence in the planning, performance, or reporting research. So this is what the central board will investigate, and they have investigated that since 2020. The inquiry concluded that this is a clear and reasonable line to be drawn between breaches of good scientific practices that should be investigated on a national level and cases that should be continue to be handled by the research institutions. What actually happened was that the university still needed to deal with what was really complicated, I think, namely all the other kinds of misconduct there is other than FFP. And here ALLEA-'s Code of Conduct has played an important role. And I'm a member of the expert group in the Association of the Swedish Higher Education Institutions, SHF, and we published a recommendation that addressed the handling of other deviations than research misconduct as defined in the Swedish law. And here ALLEA-'s code was considered to be the best available standards. We concluded that. But what is perhaps even more important to know is that the list of unacceptable practices builds very much on ALLEA-'s Code of Conduct. So to the left here, you see the list in the recommendations, and this is in Swedish, of course, but it is very it's close to ALLEA-'s phrasing in the code. So ALLEA has played an important role, but as has already been said by previous speakers, it's difficult to take ALLEA and use it in the legal framework, and what we have seen the last year since we got this centralized system is that we see a tension between ALLEA-'s code that is very good code, but it is very short. It should be short. It's only 7 pages if you don't include the title page and other appendices and so on. And this means, of course, that not every kind of misconduct is listed. Some principles, rules, and examples are open to interpretation and should be that. But this also creates a problem because it makes the code less predictable and perhaps is a problem with respect to legal certainty, and that might be a problem. So we need to progress and discuss many other issues. And since 2020, since the new law was passed in Sweden, there are many issues that needs to be addressed again, but 3 issues has caught my attention. We need to discuss what constitutes seriousness in the context of scientific misconduct, not only list different versions of misconduct, but discuss this aspect. We also, at least in Sweden, need to discuss what constitutes gross negligence in relation to honest mistake, for example, because this is now codified in Swedish law, and we need to discuss this. And I think we need to discuss this in Europe, not only in Sweden. And also, I think it's very important with today to discuss accountability in big projects when we have multi-author, multi-researcher projects, how to understand who is accountable for what, and not only what they say that they are accountable for, but how we should understand it when we investigate allegations of scientific misconduct. So this was all I had to say.
Thank you, Mats. That was a very interesting presentation. I'm going to check if we have any questions from the chats or the Q&A. We have one from Maura, who would love to see the expanded list of unacceptable research practices developed in Sweden. So if you have a link, preferably in English, maybe that you can share with us, that would be great. I guess that some people attending would also be interested in that. No other questions so far, unless anybody wants to add. I maybe had a small add to the last slide that you made, where you talk about the need for further discussion on issues related to the seriousness and the negligence and the accountability. I totally agree on that, because I think that there is a lot of room for clarification there, that we definitely need to tackle this. I maybe would like to add that in my opinion, the accountability is a very interesting one, not just for the big projects. I maybe would like to broaden it to accountability for all the partners involved in this, because it's not just about the researchers, but for example, also about the universities. How accountable are universities and university infrastructure when it comes to, for example, research misconduct? Also mentors. If you are confronted with issues that relate to PhD students, for example, how accountable is a promoter, a mentor in these issues? I think that raises a lot of questions. And to add one more is, from my experience, intent. I found that a very difficult one, and it's often referred to. What is the intent of a person to do that? But it's not an easy thing to prove or to take into reasoning when you're talking about, for example, research integrity. So I think these issues are a great agenda for more debate. Thank you so much for that. I'm thinking that we can move on to the last presentation, and that is the one from Kat, and Kat is already showing up. Great, thank you. Kat is a policy advisor on academic integrity in TU Delft Integrity Office, where she focuses on issues such as research compliance, research integrity, plagiarism, and fraud. And she also acts as the secretary for the Human Research Ethics Committee. Kath, the next 10 minutes are yours.
Thanks very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present here. I'm going to do a little bit of a fly through. So not very much detail, but to give you a bit of an idea of what we're doing at TU Delft in the Netherlands. I'm trying to share my screen. Hold on. Okay. Am I sharing my screen okay?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, great. Perfect. Okay, so I'm working in the Netherlands, but I come from England, so hence the mismatch between where I'm based and how I speak. And in the Netherlands, we have basically two codes that we're implementing. In practice, we're implementing the Netherlands code, but we also, certainly at the TU Delft, have our eye on ALLEA. And I think what's pertinent to this particular conversation is the relationship between the ALLEA and the Dutch codes. So I think that this is an example of where a national code has been developed for quite some time, but has been developed very much in parallel and interaction with the European code. So we have these two codes, the ALLEA-code and the Netherlands code, both of which have been updated quite recently. But if you look at the history of both documents, and you don't need to look at all the detail, and if you're interested in the detail, the slides will be available later. But basically, the important thing here is that at the start of this process, it was a Dutch document based on advice on scientific integrity, put together by the higher education institutes and bodies of the Netherlands, was incorporated really into the sort of ALLEA discussion on integrity, research integrity in about 2003. And it was this document that was incorporated both into the starting point of the Netherlands Code of Practice and into the starting point of the ALLEA-code of practice, although as we've seen, ALLEA has been changed substantially in the recent revision. The next important step is that following the publication of the ALLEA update in 2017, this was also referred to and incorporated quite significantly into the Netherlands Code. And the Netherlands Code would say, says explicitly that really it's an expanded version of the ALLEA-code with its own considerations, but also provides detail on really how to implement the ALLEA-code. So it's an example of what was being discussed earlier about here's a framework and here's how you can embed it at a national level. If you compare the two codes, and again, don't look at all the detail here, but I'll go through it very quickly. If we look at the good research practices and how they map from the ALLEA-code and how they map into the Netherlands Code, pretty much you get the duties of care that were also mentioned earlier, mapping pretty much from many of the good research practices identified in ALLEA. So these are the ones that are blue. Then if we do the same with the remaining good research practices from ALLEA, they map more or less onto the standards for good research practices. And funnily enough, the one point was the one that Maura mentioned earlier, is collaborative working isn't specifically mentioned in the Netherlands Code of Conduct, but it is there in terms of talking about partnerships. So it's not a separate section, but it is nevertheless included. Then again, if we look at the principles, respect from the ALLEA-code isn't specified in the Dutch code, but again, it's explicit about this, saying that respect is kind of at the interface between research and social integrity. So in terms of at TU Delft, specifically not at the Netherlands level in general, in terms of implementation, we've very much taken the guidance from both of these codes, which both say the same thing, that it's an organizational responsibility to provide an environment which promotes and stimulates the development and embedding of a particular culture within which students and staff can meet the professional standards that are detailed in the in the codes, and the outcome is desirable rather than undesirable impact. And obviously, a significant part of this are dealing with violations, complaints, investigations, and sanctions. So we've been through, at Delft, we've basically been through both of these documents and through a kind of coding process, and you could probably do this many different ways. We've drawn out some of the different elements of each of these four main components. So with environment, we've got policies and procedures. Within culture, we've got research integrity, professional development, and professionalism. Within professional standards, we have things like compliance, but for us, research quality is a main thing. And in terms of outcomes, we're looking at the impact really on science, society, environment, but also on the research profession itself. Again, violations, complaints, and investigations and sanctions are key. We see research quality as being the fundamental, the bottom line here in terms of what we're trying to achieve, and the consequences of good or bad research quality in terms of impact in the outside world and on science itself. And within these various elements of environment and culture, there's a lot of different work that we're doing. But in culture, I would say that we're focusing at the moment on integrity as a general thing and raising awareness about it. And one of the things that we're looking at, which is important and difficult, is rewards and recognition. So looking at the brief from Borana and the kinds of approach that we're taking at Delft, we're doing a number of different, we're developing a number of different initiatives. So policy development is one angle, and development of codes and how you actually implement things another. Then we have how do we address it at the system level, and how do we address it at the problem level. So starting with the problems, we updated our complaints regulations at TU Delft in January 2020. So this was a direct outcome from both the ALLEA and Netherlands codes being published in 2017 and 18 respectively. We've also been developing our complaints and appeals systems, and this is now looking like a significant piece of work to ensure that with the changing requirements of students and staff, and also that very key issue about the innocence of an accused party until proven otherwise, this is forming the basis of our attention. And there are many details within the Netherlands code as formed within the framework of the ALLEA-code, which we're using for reference in doing this. In terms of looking at the system rather than addressing only the problems, TU Delft developed this vision on integrity in 2018, and this was developed in consultation with staff and students throughout a fairly extensive process. And as a consequence of this vision, we established the TU Delft Integrity Office, which is where I work. This really started in July this year. So there's been 2 or 3 years of preparation for this, and the office itself has now started business. And as you can see, academic integrity is an important part of it, but also so is social integrity, organizational integrity, and the boundaries between these three. We've also redeveloped our code of ethics into a code of conduct, which refers specifically to the Netherlands Code of Conduct. And as was mentioned earlier, NWO, well, the funding body here is critical. So the NVO, the Dutch Funding Research Council, basically require all researchers applying for funding to be aware of and be aspiring to complying with the Netherlands Code of Conduct and thereby the ALLEA-code. But we're also very interested in the kind of mismatch between what the academic community really values and what the academic community is moving towards valuing. And in the Netherlands, this Room for Everyone's Talent is an initiative from the VSNU, the body which represents all 15 universities in the Netherlands. And this is paving the way really for valuing different contributions to the whole research process, and thereby removing some of the potentially perverse incentives on academic development and academic success being such a kind of narrow range of successes. And again, this is supported in the Netherlands by the research assessment methods, also at the VSNU level. So within the strategy evaluation protocol for the next 5 years, but also the last 5 years, then academic integrity and social integrity are part of the research assessment. And we're looking currently at the Hong Kong principles in terms of what other initiatives are there globally, which give us an insight into how can we help our staff develop, our academic staff develop, so that they are conducting responsible research practices, but that doesn't reduce their competitiveness in what is a global endeavor. So I'm gonna forget this slide. And then the takeaways for us are that the ALLEA and Netherlands Code of Conduct form the basis of an integrity-related policy development and implementation strategies at TU Delft. We've set up a dedicated integrity office, and that this has these 3 different pillars that I talked about. Our goal is to get the right balance between deterring misconduct and promoting and celebrating good research practice, because we are also very aware of the pressures on academics already. And it's, at the end of the day, is a fairly small, very small proportion of researchers that are committing serious misconduct and intentionally, or even being aware. And this involves developing and improving tools and awareness, but also we're looking at the underlying system. So as I referred to earlier, the work on rewards and recognition. And then finally, the implications of how we deal with this for researchers are global. And so while we want to help them develop within the Netherlands system, we need to keep them competitive in the global system. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kat, for this presentation. I'm quite impressed with the work you are doing at TU Delft and the building of the Research Integrity Office. It seems very promising, so we'll definitely keep an eye on that. I see that there are no questions in the chat nor in the questions and answers. So unless something pops up in the next 2 minutes, I would maybe just like to add that, well, I'm also very curious on how you will implement the Hong Kong principles and the extra attention that you will be offering to looking at ways to foster competitiveness in all of this for researchers, because it is quite a big challenge I find myself in. So maybe in the future that is definitely an issue that we should look into even deeper. I see no questions. So oh yes, I do see one. Maura asks a question, in building up your policy and implementation, are you engaging with researchers in the developmental process?
Absolutely. So the code of conduct was, in actual fact, we have an integrity board, which is an advisory board for the Integrity Office, and many of the people on that are academics. The whole vision on integrity was also somewhat researcher-led, admittedly coming from research ethics largely. But in terms of actually developing the policies thereafter, it's very much a consultative approach. So at the end of the day, the people who are going to be dealing with this on the ground are the researchers. So both in terms of developing policy, it's highly consultative. And in actual fact, we're just planning now a couple of meetings in this coming year. One will consult our extended integrity infrastructure, which is actually quite widespread, and tracking it down across a large and complex organization is part of our first tasks. So where are all of these different things happening, and then bringing them all together. And then in the later half of the year, bringing the academics into that specifically. But also in terms of ensuring that the integrity structure is complete, is known and works. But also in terms of actual implementation, I'm already working closely with a couple of departments who have approached us on the basis of wanting to assess and address, if there are any needs to address, academic integrity issues arising in their departments. So we're already getting demand from researchers for us to work with them on that.
That's quite a promising tendency if people are starting to come to you and ask them to guide them. So that looks very promising for you. Yes,
absolutely.
Thank you, Maura, also for the great question. I think I am supposed to give the word back to Borana now, or
yes.
Okay.
I think that we are slowly going to an end for this session. Thank you to all of you for very interesting conversation, and also to all who wrote in the chat and in the Q&A. And now we'll have a more interactive, if you want, session where we'll be able also to put our videos on and the camera, and we'll have a plenary discussion based also on the discussions of this morning. So my colleague Johanna, she will put the link in the chat. We will exit from this session in here. If you don't manage to see the chat, you can use the link that I've sent to you by email. So let's meet in 15 minutes. Maybe we can meet 3:05, just to allow ourselves some time to stretch our legs. And it might take a few minutes to let you in, but bear with me. We'll meet soon in 15 minutes for another round of discussions. For those who don't manage to join, I wanted to make a small announcement for the next ERION meeting that probably you have put in your agendas March 2021 in next month. But please stay tuned because the meeting is postponed to May. So soon we will send you an email with the new date. So see you at the next session and enjoy the small break.